Hi. I was just waiting for the timer to start and it seemed to stall a little bit. This week there has been a development which may or may not have implications elsewhere, and that is that Germany has agreed to pay compensation to descendants of the Herero and Namaqua people. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, in what is now modern day Namibia. So this refers to the fact that when Germany was a colonial power there, it was then German Southwest Africa. They committed a genocide, and it's generally seen as the first genocide of the 20th century. Death toll is uncertain, but it may be as high as 100,000, and the conservative figure is 25,000. So a lot of people died, and it's seen as the first genocide of the 20th century. I won't get into all the history of that, A, because I'm not informed enough to do so, and B, because I want to talk about some of the implications around it and where I lie with it. Firstly, I'm not going to criticise either Germany or Namibia. This is obviously a decision they've reached mutually. I understand that the descendants of those who were affected are going to be paid compensation, and that's going to be in the form of social programs. Um, so whether or not that there will be any financial compensation, or this is purely going to be in the form of social programs that will help these people. Several news sites have done a report on this, and it showed that the descendants were quite impoverished. Um, it's a relatively poor African country, and maybe it's not a country we hear much about, um, other than for its quite rich wildlife. But it's not one of the better documented or high profile African nations. Also, an unusual aspect of this is that Germany was one of the smaller empires in Africa. It didn't have anywhere near the sort of extent of territory that the British, French, or Belgians did. Um, I believe at one point Sweden even had a small part of Africa, but I might be mistaken with that. Anyway, I was looking at a thread where the person posting it was asking could this start a precedent, and that's an interesting question because for a long time now there has been demands that European powers, specifically European powers, make compensation to those descended from those who lived under their empires and from injustices that happened. From the outset, let me be clear that I think that progressive modern countries should be honest about the past. And few countries are as connected to imperial legacy as Britain. The reason I say that is because we were the biggest empire. The British Empire was vast. Sun literally didn't set on the British Empire, and it shaped the modern world. I could make a lot of videos just on the subject of the British Empire. I'm not going to do that obviously today because there's so many aspects of it that it's a subject I'm interested in. But I also feel that the debate has kind of been hijacked by the Marxist left, those who want to give a totally black and white view, like empire was evil and that's it. I say evil things were done under empire, but I say that you have to look at the context. You have to, if you're going to judge the British Empire, you have to weigh it up against other empires. This was a point made by Neil Ferguson in his excellent book Empire, which was not, as some claimed, an apology for empire. It was simply an honest account of how empire was envisaged and how the British approached empire. It was in no way trying to downplay atrocities like Amritsar. Um, the book doesn't do that. It doesn't censor those things. Um, as a Briton, I am the first to acknowledge we've done some unforgivable things. I mean, the way we suppressed the Indian rebellion of 1857 was particularly brutal. There's no getting away from that. We done some pretty brutal things, and there were other atrocities in India. In India, Amritsar's probably the best known one. There would have been others, and in Ireland. Um, there's no getting away from that, and I've never ever been someone to deny those things. What I do say though is that there is curious thing with just looking at Western powers. I also think that this gets into complicated territory because at what point do you still attach culpability to a successor state or indeed successor relatives? What I mean by that is when it starts becoming generational and when an event goes beyond living history, excuse me, beyond living memory, then at what point does that become still relevant in terms of compensation? Because if you really, really take that argument to its full, then in theory, the Mongolian government today would have to pay the Iraqi government for the pillage and the plunder committed by Mongols. I don't think it was Genghis Khan, I think it was one of his successors. In 1258, in Baghdad, that ranks as one of the bloodiest urban sieges in human history. Some sources suggest about 1 million people were killed. Even if that's an exaggeration, it's clear that it was devastated. Now, a lot of people would say, oh, well, that's ridiculous. It's 700 years ago. And Mongolia and Iraq are both middle level powers today. So, Mongolia is not as powerful as it once was. It's no longer the largest contiguous empire. We were the biggest empire, but they were the biggest contiguous empire. Um, but I doubt if Mongolia and Iraq even have particularly strong relations. I can't think of any sort of mutual interest they would have. But yeah, people might say that's absurd. Um, but this is the problem. Where do you draw a line? Where do you draw a line? I mean, Native Americans, they were subjugated and suffered greatly. But again, when it starts getting generational, and then you get into the question of, well, what about Native Americans who subjugated other Native Americans? So should the Dakota Sioux Nation pay compensation to the Pawnee for the massacre in 1874, in fact known as Massacre Canyon, when a Sioux war party attacked the Pawnee during a buffalo hunt, and they indiscriminately killed them, including women and children. That's just as brutal as anything white settlers done. And this is not a case of whataboutery. It's a case of how do you address this? Because on the issue of compensation, here's the problem. Let's say, for example, we pay India compensation for Amritar. Well, it was 1919, so the chances of there being any direct survivors around now is very low. Even if there are a few, it will be a very, very small number of people. I think there could be a case to pay direct compensation to people directly involved, and I think this is the case with another one of our controversial colonial episodes, the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya. There was ethnic Mau Maus who were not ethnic Mau Maus, actually it was a movement, but there were Kenyans who were tortured by the British. No, I think we probably should pay those people compensation because they're elderly. There's not that many of them. I think probably we could do that, or at least support them in some way. But veterans of that conflict would say, well, the Mau Mau were terrorists. They were killing Kenyan civilians. Um, so it was in the context of a brutal insurgency. Um, I don't think the Mau Mau should be glorified. They deliberately killed civilians. However, we as the colonial power, had a certain moral responsibility, and we didn't always uphold that. It would be a lie to say that we did. Um, of course, now there's a big controversy over veterans and whether or not they are prosecuted for past crime. Maybe that's for another video. But again, on that, well, okay, if you're going to prosecute veterans, then how about terrorists? I mean, yes, in Northern Ireland, if you're hauling up 70 and 80-year-old men for things they may or may not have done, and actually in many cases they were cleared by previous tribunals, um, putting them in a never-ending limbo when they might well be completely innocent, that seems cruel. If then terrorists don't face justice. When it comes to Northern Ireland, Tony Blair suggested there could be a sort of truth and reconciliation style situation, much like South Africa. But the truth is, there's no easy answers to these things. And I do not support prosecuting elderly soldiers if terrorists can get off the hook. I will put a caveat to that, though. I don't agree with those conservatives who say that our boys can never do wrong. The reality is sometimes soldiers do go renegade and do go too far. And I do think that where allegations are made, they need to be taken very seriously at the time. Now, in today's context, if a British soldier or service personnel was accused of abusing his or her position, I take the view it needs to be investigated immediately. Can't be left to linger. Because I suppose that would be the other argument. The reason these things take so long is because they are brushed under the carpet initially. Although, um, it's a difficult thing because then the right say you're not patriotic or you're attacking the military. Not at all. I think modern militaries, and this is the thing actually about the British Armed Forces, I think they are very professional for the most part, compared to some of the counterparts around the world. Generally speaking, soldiers that abuse their position are disciplined. They're court-martialed, and the military takes it very seriously because they know it's damaging for hearts and minds. So I am relatively confident that it's something that is taken seriously. But does that mean that, you know, when service personnel cross a line, they are always guaranteed to face justice? No, it doesn't. There are examples. Baha Musa, the man in Iraq who was uh, badly beaten by British troops, him and his family, were, I don't know if they ever saw justice. But this is, again, you then ask, well, where is the legal barometer of things like this? I mean, if you get a situation of allegations and soldiers deny it, what then? Um, I think in a war zone, chaotic things can happen, and it's easy for me in the comfort of, you know, my bedroom in the UK to say these things. But I do think, on the issue of compensation, to get back to that, I think probably a wealthy, powerful country like the UK could give compensation to direct survivors and maybe the children. But I do question when it starts getting into the realm of grandchildren and great grandchildren, where does that end? Um, is the modern British government really responsible for what the great 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 grandchildren of, people who died in, say, one of the famines that took place in the Raj during Victoria's reign? There's a lot of things that, and the truth is, most of those people never see any compensation. But there's another area. I mean, foreign aid. European countries are particularly generous with foreign aid, and I'm not saying they shouldn't be, but this idea that we stole, the resources from developing countries. Well, we pay millions every year in foreign aid. Now, I'm not saying it's the same as compensation, but the idea we just take and there's no giving back isn't true. Also, if we give money to a country like India, this is a country that has its own space program. India today is a pretty powerful country. Still has a lot of poverty, but it's a pretty powerful country. So, Indians often talk about we demand, I'm talking about Indian politicians here, we want a mutual playing field. Well, if it's really about a mutual playing field, is paying compensation now to a country that has its own space program, is that a balanced playing field? I mean, I suppose you could argue if it goes directly to survivors of an atrocity, but then, you know, post independence India, look at the Blue Star, Operation Blue Star in 1984. Thousands of Sikhs murdered in response to the assassination of Indira Gandhi by her bodyguards. Have those Sikhs been given compensation by their own government? I do find it rather galling for countries to lash out at other countries when they won't acknowledge what they've done to their own people. One of the biggest culprits of this, of course, is China. I mean, far more Chinese have died at the hands of Chinese regimes, both imperial Chinese and subsequent Communist Party, than any foreign invader, even the Japanese. And, I'm not downplaying what the Japanese done, it was evil. Japan might be the one exception of a country outside the West that is always pressured and pushed for compensation. In that case, you do have living descendants because World War II is within living memory. So you have, for example, women in Philippines, China, South Korea, who were comfort women, who were basically sex slaves. I do think Japan should give them compensation. Japan's record is somewhat mixed. It has made formal apologies for wartime actions, and yet you also have Japanese politicians visiting the Yasukuni Shrine. You have Japanese historians questioning the history. So its record's a little bit checkered. Um, I remember having a debate with a Chinese colleague of mine about Japan, and I sort of agreed with her. Yeah, they've done terrible things. I mean, they treated Allied POWs abysmally. But I sort of followed up, well, has China acknowledged what happened in the Great Leap Forward? And she immediately got on the defensive. So before any country points fingers, it needs to look at its background. And as a Briton, I say, we done inexcusable things. I don't deny that. But I think probably the approach that David Cameron took of expressing great regret when he visited Amritsar was probably the right one. Because if he'd made a full apology, then it gets into the realm, what else do we apologize for? Do we apologize for all the crimes of empire going way back? And then to who? And would it be um, applicable for a contemporary government to apologize for the actions of predecessors? So, getting back to the original point, I don't criticize Germany or Namibia. It's something that they've reached mutually, that's between those two countries. But in terms of it setting a precedent, I don't know. I think European powers uh, should acknowledge the past. And conservatives who want to say that we never done anything wrong, that's not true. We did. But every hegemony in history has blood on its hands from all over the world. If you look at the millions and millions killed by the Islamic conquests, many millions, particularly in India, I mean, it counts as one of the worst atrocities in history. That's why, from a Muslim perspective in particular, to point fingers at the West is pretty galling. I will not accept that sort of hypocrisy. To vilify the West that has done so much for the modern world, particularly Britain. Say what you want about the British Empire, but this country, in many ways, made the modern world. So when it comes to education, for example, I think that we should be honest about that. But I don't like the way that the left are pushing for it to just be vilified, and that's it. Teaching young people that we were once the world's biggest hegemony, but we were terrible people. That's it. That's not balanced, and I don't think it's honest. We also need to tell them about the Westminster system of government, the spread of the English language, the rule of law. There are a lot of things that were positive from the British Empire, and a lot of things that were negative. We need a balanced approach. I'm not calling for our crimes to be overlooked or downplayed. I'm calling for a balanced approach. That's all. But the left, they would just have a situation of the wicked British went in and killed all the natives and took all their land, and that was it. It's not honest, and it's oversimplifying a complex aspect of human history, the rise of empires. We were by no means unique, but we were the largest. We'll wrap this up soon, but honestly, there's so many angles to take with this, and people might judge me. That's fine. I accept in a video like this, that's inevitable. But I am simply calling for a balanced outlook. I think where we have a situation of direct culpability, what I mean by that is, like I mentioned, if you have something happening in the exact time, it needs to be dealt with. So if soldiers are accused of atrocities, that needs to be investigated immediately, and thoroughly and without bias. Um, Precisely so that it doesn't linger for years afterwards, and so that the guilty are held to account and the innocent aren't. Well, one of the unsettling things about the Northern Ireland thing is I think that there are innocent men who have been accused of troubles, um, abuses, maybe simply because they were in the same regiment. That's wrong. I think you can imagine these men are now in their 70s and 80s in many cases, and they're just being left in this constant limbo. They don't know if they're going to get the police knocking on the door. That's cruel. If they've been cleared previously, it needs to rest with that. Because there can't be reconciliation in Northern Ireland if it's only one-sided. Recently, there was a Ballymurphy inquiry, which showed that those citizens were totally innocent and they had their names cleared. That's good. It's good that those families have got peace, and that they're not smeared as being killed because they were terrorists, because they were not terrorists. Um, but there were many atrocities in the troubles, uh, and you had situations, for example, police officers who were simply doing traffic checks were murdered by terrorists, simply because they had oil in their hotel. Um, so there were a lot of terrible things happened in that conflict, and if it's just one-sided, if it's only a case of let's go after the British, there's not going to be peace in Northern Ireland because British veterans and the unionist community will rightly raise a question of what about culpability for Irish Republican terrorists? Um, if we look at Africa, you could look at all sorts of things. I mean, look at what the Belgians done in the Congo. That was one of the very worst imperial crimes ever. You know, terrible cruelty. Congolese miners, even children having their hands chopped off. And King Leopold II was truly one of the worst. Um, Belgium's a small country today, and the successor state, the Democratic Republic of Congo, is a huge country. I do think Belgium should do what it can to try and help the infrastructure of that country do something because it's a small country, but it's a wealthy country. So I'm not against, for example, wealthy countries have prospered from empire doing the role to try and help build up developing countries. But at some point, you also have to question accountability of successor states. So, take Zimbabwe, for example. It was once a breadbasket of Africa, and it became a lot worse, I would argue, under Mugabe than it was under the British. I mean, if you look at the GDP of some of those states in the successor years, it actually decreased from outside the empire. I'm not saying that's an excuse for empire, but it's just a fact. It's just a fact. Look at the number of corrupt African dictators who have, played up the nationalist card, and they were initially seen as Pan-Africanist heroes as they rose up against the colonial powers. I mean, Idi Amin's one of the best known, but there's others as well. And the amount of cruelty and suffering and bloodshed that they caused, sometimes in a matter of years, could definitely rival anything the Empire done. Um, so, just to conclude with this, in no way am I trying to whitewash the crimes of empire. All I'm saying is that if we get into the realm of compensation, because there's actually another point, there's a practical side. If you're given direct compensation to relatives, ancestors of an atrocity, you'd have to have a foolproof system that they're definitely directly related to it because you might have a situation where it then gets abused and people claim they were affected, but they might not have a direct link to those that were. I mean, if that sounds cynical, consider even in modern tragedies with the Grenfell fire disaster we had in the UK, there were people claiming to have lost their flat in Grenville or lost relatives, and they were just fraudsters, they were just liars, they were just trying to get money. So, making a blanket statement of compensation would be a big mistake because then you open the floodgates and anyone could just say, oh, well, my great 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 grandfather was possibly killed by the British, give me money. Um, no, I think where you have a direct link, maybe I would cut off the point at grandchildren. Beyond that, I think it's starting to get too far. Children, grandchildren, but beyond grandchildren, I'm not convinced because then you're getting further and further back in time, and where do you draw the line? Again, taken to its extreme, Where I live, northeast England, maybe we should claim compensation from Denmark because the Vikings pillaged my city in the year 866. Now, you're going to say, or some might say, it's hyperbole, Nathan. That's a bad comparison because the British Empire was only 100 years ago as opposed to 1,000 years ago. But it is absurd, and that's my point. Where do you draw the line? Because the injustices of history are many, and no power in history can claim total innocence. So I do get a bit frustrated when shame and the guilt is uniquely thrown at the West. Um, when countries like China, particularly, but even within African states, um, there is no innocent power in history when it comes to bloodshed. There really isn't, if you really get into it. Um, the Mongols committed some of the worst atrocities in human history. It's estimated 50 million people died during the conquest. Yet Genghis Khan is, still seen as a national hero. Um, could it be that Mongolia is just the middle-ranking power, so it doesn't have the same international clout as, say, the UK or France? Therefore, it's not as uniquely shamed. Could it be because it was just a long time ago, further back? Could it be that Mongolia itself went through a lot of transitions? Who knows? And that's no disrespect to Mongolians. In fact, Mongolia's had recently quite a successful transition to democracy. Um, right, I'm going to wrap this up, but I think honestly, these are complex questions. And it's not a simple case of the Europeans came in, they should just pay out money. Then you get into, well, who do they pay the money to? Where do you draw a line? And then are you going to apply a universal standard for all powers? Are African states going to pay compensation to other African states because their predecessor tribal groups subjugated others? There's so many, when it comes to empire, there are so many nuances and so many angles that you could look at. And I think both the left and right are guilty of distorting it. The right tends to downplay the bad things that happened, but the left, they just vilify it. They say the British Empire evil, that's it. And I think that's wrong. Something so big and influential can't have been all good or all bad. I mean, look at the powers of antiquity. Would we say that Greece and Rome were entirely bad? Absolutely not. Yet we know they've done terrible things, particularly Rome. But I think most people would acknowledge Rome was a great power with a great influence on the world for the most part. Yet, you know, they brutally crucified Christians. They were constantly at war. It was a very blood-soaked empire. So I don't think you can talk about these things in black and white terms. And that's what I think the left want to do when it comes to education. And I think that's wrong, and I think it needs to be resisted.